strangely, people are able to hear one another speaking in a language they understand, and and that is a bizarre thing because the peoples come from all over different parts of the ancient world, and they're able to understand one another. So I think that's a sort of undoing of the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11, because now instead of the confusion of the language, we have the unification of language, really the universalization of the church. You could call it the Catholicizing of the church in Acts chapter 2, in which we have everyone brought together again. So there in that key moment, that beginning of the book of Acts in chapter 2, I think we have some definition of what the church is in terms of being inclusive and universal in its scope. Everyone can belong to the church, is the I think is the point in Acts chapter 2, Jew and Gentile alike. Then we also talked about briefly the concept of chosenness in the Old Testament and the call of Abram in Genesis chapter 12, so that in between the universal creation of humanity in God's image in Genesis 1, on the one hand, and the coming together of the church as a unity in Acts chapter 2, we have the particular call of Abram in Genesis chapter 12, in which God tells Abram to go to a land that he will show him, and that all the families of the earth will find blessing in him. So we examined that sentence and that what does that phrasing mean a little bit last week. All right. That's basically some of the ground that we covered last time. We also ended last week by talking about the idea of the foreign woman. This is a phrase, it's a concept that's important in Deuteronomy, the foreign woman, and it seems to have 1 Kings, I think First Kings in mind. I'm just going to go back to that here. Let's see. See if I can find this. I believe it's in Deuteronomy 7. Let me see here. Yes. So last time we looked at Deuteronomy chapter 7. It says, when the Lord your God brings you into the land which you are about to enter into possess, and removes many nations before you, Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, all these different peoples, when God gives them over to you and you defeat them, put them under the ban. We talked about that idea of the ban a little bit last time. Make no covenant with them. Don't be gracious to them. Another translation says, show them no mercy. Verse 3 says, you shall not intermarry with them, neither giving your daughters to their sons, nor taking their daughters for your sons, for they would turn your sons from following me to serving other gods, and then the anger of the Lord or Yahweh would flare up against you, and he would quickly destroy you. So there's a strong emphasis in this text, in this passage, on not intermarrying, not intermingling with peoples who are outside of Israel. Okay, so I don't think this text is saying it's not all right to um, marry for. I don't think the proper application of this text is that today we can't marry or enter into holy marriage with the sacrament with people who are different from us, who look different from us. I don't think that's what this text is saying. I think this is talking about the total allegiance of Israel to Yahweh. That's what's at question here. They would turn your sons from following me to serving other gods, and then the anger would flare up against you. So Israel is supposed to be devoted to Yahweh, and the danger of taking other peoples into the community is that that would involve the worship of other gods. So a good example of that is in 1 Kings 11. Here we see that Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. Okay. And it says in verse 3, they turned his heart, right? Um, Nations from which the Lord had said, you shall not join with them, and they shall not join with you, lest they turn your hearts to their gods. And that's exactly what happens with Solomon. These foreign women turn the hearts of Solomon and ultimately the hearts of the people of Israel away from Yahweh. So this is precisely what Deuteronomy 7 is warning against. And this is the beginning of a downward spiral for Israel, because once this happens, this is the beginning of the downfall of the kingdom of Israel, and Solomon's son, who comes after him, loses the northern kingdom of Israel, and ultimately the northern kingdom of Israel goes into exile, and then the same thing happens to the southern kingdom of Judah, and this is really the beginning of the end of the monarchy of the kingdom of Israel, really. Okay, let's see. I want to show you this other passage quickly here. What I want to end up on today, I think we're talking about Hagar today. I want to talk about Hagar and the foreign women, and that's basically what we have planned for today. Okay, so in Ezra, this is a moment when the southern kingdom of Judah has gone into Babylonian captivity, and now they have come back. So we're talking about 5th century into the 4th century BC. The people of Judah, now we're calling them Jews, now they have returned back into the land of Israel, and they have been restored, and that's all very good, wonderful, good news. But the problem is that when they come back from their Babylonian captivity um, under the Persian king, now they discover living in the land other peoples. And what happens is they take as wives from among the peoples who are living in the land of Israel when they return from their Babylonian captivity. Does that make sense? Okay. And this is a problem when we get to Ezra chapter 10. Let me see if I can find the. Okay. So here in this moment, Ezra and the community realize that they are in trouble because they have essentially repeated the same sin, the same problem that started Israel down the path toward their doom in the first place. Because as soon as they get back from exile, which was initiated because of Solomon's marriage to all these foreign women, as soon as they get back from exile, here they find themselves again having married foreign women. That's what happens. Okay. So it says Ezra prayed and acknowledged their guilt, weeping and prostrate before the house of God, a very large assembly. Shechaniah, the son of Jehiel, one of the descendants, made an appeal to Ezra. We have indeed betrayed our God by taking as wives foreign women from the peoples of the land. Yet in spite of this, there still remains a hope. Let us therefore enter into a covenant before our God to dismiss all of our foreign wives and the children born of them, in keeping with what you, my Lord, advise, and those who are in dread of the commandments of our God. Let it be done according to the law. Rise then, for this is your duty. We are with you, so have courage and act. And this is what they do. The people who have married the men who have married these foreign wives and they have had children, they put their families and their foreign wives and their children aside, and they leave them. But that's what happens when they come back from exile. Let's see. Okay, so it says, give praise to the Lord, the God of your ancestors, do his will, separate yourselves from the peoples of the land and from the foreign women. In answer, the whole assembly cried out with a loud voice, yes, it is our duty to do as you say. So that's what happens, and the exiles did as agreed. And by the first day of the first month, they had finished dealing with all the men who had taken foreign wives. Okay, so let's see here. What do you all think? What do you all think of this story and of this concept? How does it make you feel that this is what happens in Israel's story? What do you think about this? Would you like to get into? Could I put you into breakout sessions? Maybe partners of two or three people and have a little conversation to debrief this. Is that okay? All right. Let's see. We'll go for about 3 or 4 minutes, and I'd like for you to discuss this and you see what you think. Okay, hello.
Are you in mute, Father? Oh.
Nadie está en mi grupo.
Okay, we're here.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay.
I'm just thinking maybe I'm reading way too much into this, but it's very painful to hear first generation immigrants that don't know how to deal when their sons and daughters are marrying people from other cultures and other religions. Um, that's what makes me think right now, how the immigrant communities are dealing with that as they go about, to see their children marrying people from other cultures and other religions.
En mi opinión, me enojo a oír la solución del problema, porque eso es ofensa contra las mujeres y los niños. Pero yo pienso es normal. Cuando inmigrantes lleguen en los Estados Unidos a proteger su identidad, por favor, no mezcla con, por ejemplo, hispanos y africanos americanos o hispanos y personas de Asia. José, ¿cómo estás?
Padre,
Dime
bien,
su
gracias, padre.
opinión.
Es un tema fuerte, creo, y delicado,
Sí, delicado, claro.
muy delicado, pero eh, pues no estoy de acuerdo con ustedes, con las dos opiniones de ustedes, de los dos. Es muy difícil, pues, adaptarnos o que se adapten, especialmente ya las otras familias. Si, si alguno de nuestros hijos eso decidiera, pues yo tengo dos, tres hijos, ¿no? Uno tiene su novia hispana Él lo puedo mencionar, el mediano no ha tenido novia todavía, pero mencionaba que como que le tira para hispana. Y eso es su mención de él. I will be there. Y, y es que, perdón, pero me toca aquí estar en un puesto de la feria y ya me andan regañando. Sí, es un tema difícil. Comprendernos en nuestras culturas, por mucho, por ejemplo, pues nuestros hijos crecen con un poquito de los dos, ¿no? Sin embargo, la raíz que, por ejemplo, en este caso mis hijos traen más, es más la de nosotros por ser mexicanos. Aunque aquí nacieron y pues son de aquí y todo, nuestra casa hablamos español, hasta la comida pues es más mexicana. Este, me cuesta cocinar tanto, la verdad.
Gracias, José. Tal vez es interesante compartir en las páginas del periódico de Los Ángeles. Una persona escribió, ahora hay desafío en las familias hispanas latinos porque muchos hijos no comprenden español. Ellos no pueden comunicar con abuelos. ¿Verdaderos hispanos o no?
Yeah,
Uh,
I don't think it's not only LA, you talk Chicago, Texas, we've been through this.
Padre, Seymour, tenemos ese problema en Seymour, en un ranchito casi.
Seymour, está bien.
Ah, John, tengo amigos que tienen la edad de sus hijos, de mis hijos. Nosotros decidimos enseñarles español, ellos no, y ahora ya lo sufren. ¿Y qué haces? Pues ya fue su decisión, ¿no? Ahora se arrepienten, pero pues ya ahorita, ya cuando el niño es adolescente es más difícil decir, no, 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 no.
Sí, pero la
Y
pregunta es
casi,
buena, ¿verdad? ¿Son hispanos o no?
sí, 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 sí. Pues sí, ¿no? Porque,
Okay, how did it go? What kinds of things did you talk about? What did you notice? I was able to join some of the groups. How did it go? What did you think about this story?
I'll go first. I was with Maribel and Gabi, and what we what happened was Maribel wanted us to share the reading, okay, to get a better idea of what of what it was about. And the conclusion was what we shared was that back then, from what we know, is that women didn't count. Um, and it must have been at least they had a husband, but then the husband had to leave them. So we could just imagine how difficult it was in their lives to leave their wives and children when women already weren't being considered as, as men were. So that's what we were sharing. Is there something else, Gabi, Maribel? Am I missing something? And that I don't know. What else? Am I missing?
I
What
think
thing?
if I can jump in quickly, thank you, Belinda. I really appreciate what you said just now about women not counting. I think you're exactly right.
Mm-hmm.
I think that and this is really an interesting topic for thinking about culture and scripture and gospel and all of that. Um, the Bible is God's revelation that God reveals to particular people in a particular place and in a particular time, and that particular people, place, and time and culture is marked by certain features and characteristics,
Mhm.
and those features and characteristics aren't necessarily the best or right even, but that just happens to be the time when God reveals himself in that moment, in that to that people, to that place, and to that time. And in the particular people and place and time that we're talking about, in the Old Testament times, it was, and you can say that even today we're still, our culture is characterized by patriarchy. I think you can safely say that, but even more so in antiquity. Um, we talk about the social fabric of ancient Israel being characterized by what we call the house of the father. The house of the father. That's the basic social building block in antiquity, the house of the father. And so the head of the house is the one who makes the decisions for the family. He represents the family. He's the father or the grandfather, and people live on a family estate, or you might call it a compound or something like that, in which you've got multiple families. You've got aunts and uncles and cousins and grandparents and nephews and nieces and everybody living in the same place, and all of it is governed by one man, right? All of it is governed, and that one man has power of life and death over what he is, the judge and the jury and the executioner. Everything that happens is according to the say of the head of the house, um, the main patriarch there of that house system. So anyway, you and we're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail in a minute. But anyway, if you're not attached to one of these patriarchal head of the house systems, then you really have no way to eat. Okay? If you're not attached to land, and the men are the ones who own the land, then you can't grow crops. You don't have any livestock. You have no means of producing oil or grain or any kind of protein to eat, right? So for the men of Israel to put away their wives and the children, like that, that's a very serious thing, such that they have no means of existing. That's why in ancient Israel, the categories of the vulnerable, which we'll talk about today, I wanted to talk about this. The main categories for the vulnerable in Israel are the widow and the orphan and the immigrant. The widow, the orphan, and the immigrant. These are three protected classes, three protected groups in Israel that are vulnerable and needy because they're not attached to land. That's the thing they all have in common. The widows and orphans and immigrants aren't attached to land. They don't own land, which puts them at a major disadvantage for having food to eat or any kind of income or anything like that. So it's a big deal for the men of Israel to put away their wife. Okay, I've been talking too much. I apologize. Forgive me. What else did you all think about this, or what else did you say?
In another group, Jose, Father, and I, we jumped immediately into what would it look like for our current immigrant families, particularly Hispanics, when they're seeing their sons and daughters marrying people from other cultures and other ethnicities and maybe other religions. And there were some interesting conversations about, well, in a way, they are either born here, raised here, and now they have the freedom to choose. Do we support? Do we stay faithful to what Hispanic Mexican means? Or how do we go about that? I basically share that I see several cases in the community where they have come to me and say, how do I support? I think the question is, what can we do to make sure that our children feel accompanied and supported in making those decisions? And Father, I'll let him speak, but was bringing this aspect of how do we stay faithful to what we see as our identity. And he even brought the question, well, um, if someone doesn't speak Spanish anymore, are we still identify ourselves with the Hispanic community?
I read an article in the newspaper in Los Angeles, and the children born in the United States, they do not read Spanish and they have a hard time speaking. They may be able to hear, but they can't speak so well. And they are teased. They're called names. Are they truly Hispanic?
Thank you. Anyone else like to comment? Thank you, Father Mike. Thank you, Oscar. Thank you, Belinda. I think what I would like to do next, actually, well, let me see if I can share screen again. Okay. Let's talk about widows, orphans, immigrants, these main categories of vulnerability in the Bible. So, talked about that a little bit already. Let's see. The Old Testament in particular, I just want to be, I want to be really clear about this, that the Old Testament forbids, prescribes exploitation for the immigrant. It commands the scripture again and again and again. It demands compassion, and it condemns people who do not show compassion to the immigrant. That's that's a theme that and I've cited here at the bottom. This is just a selection of various places. This is not an exhaustive list, but here are just a few places where it talks about about having compassion for the immigrant in particular, people who are not attached to land, because if you're not attached to land, then you can't eat, right? Anyway, okay. There's emphasis in the legislation of the Pentateuch and the Torah. There's emphasis on the equal footing of the immigrant with a native born in the legislation. That's a that's just a theme that just comes up again and again and again. Let's see if I can pull up just a few of these to show you. Exodus 22:21. Well, is it okay if I read this in English? Should I pull up the Spanish? Would that be better? Is it okay if I read it? Yeah, okay. Exodus 22:21 says, "You shall not wrong any widow or orphan. If you ever wrong them and they cry out to me, I will surely listen to their cry. My wrath will flare up, and I will kill you with the sword, and then your own wives will be widows, and your children will become orphans." Exodus 22 says, 24 says, "If you lend money to my people, the poor among you, you must not be like them." Okay, that's not the right. Let's see. Here we go. 23:9. "You shall not oppress a resident alien. You well know how it feels to be an alien, since you were once aliens yourselves in the land of Egypt." This is, in my opinion, this is an allusion to the story of Hagar. And we're going to talk about Hagar this morning also a little bit. But I think this law is a reference, is an allusion to the story of Hagar and Ishmael. So we'll come back to that in a minute. But I wanted you to see that there's an emphasis on empathy, right? Israel, um, this is legislation that God is giving to Israel after they come out of Egypt. Okay, they themselves, the Israelites, have been oppressed in Egypt as immigrants, as refugees, really. In Egypt, they have been living as immigrants or as refugees. And once they're able to get away from the oppression of Pharaoh and the Egyptians, God says to them, now you know what it feels like to be an alien. Now you know what it feels like to be an immigrant because you were once alien. And I think this word alien really is immigrant in Hebrew. I think that's really what we're talking about. Since you were once immigrants yourselves in the land of Egypt. So there's an emphasis on empathy. You know what it feels like. Don't oppress people who are immigrants. I think that's the point in Exodus 23:9 here. Emphasis on empathy. Another example, Exodus 23 says, 6 days you do your work, on the seventh day you rest, that you, your ox and donkey may have rest, so that the son of your maidservant and the immigrant, the resident alien, may be refreshed. Right? Make sure that your people who work for you, maybe there's an immigrant that works for you in some way, give them a break. When you pick, when you harvest your vineyard, right? When you're gathering on your crops, don't be meticulous. Don't be so thorough when you do your harvest that you take up every single last piece of fruit. Leave some for the poor and for the immigrant. I, the Lord, am your God. In other words, leave some food for the immigrant who doesn't have an attachment to land because they have no other way to eat. Again and again, you get this emphasis on having compassion for the immigrant, for the orphan, the widow. Here's an example in Deuteronomy 10 where you have all three of these categories together: the orphan, the widow, and the resident alien or the immigrant. Give them food and clothing. They have no other way to make it because they're not attached to land. That's something that the biblical authors are very sensitive about, and they write about that again and again, and not just in one place, but all throughout Scripture. You get that kind of emphasis for immigrants in particular. So I guess, in my view, there's maybe you might say there's a little bit of ambivalence. On the one hand, Israel is forbidden to marry um, foreign women who might cause Israel to worship other gods. But on the other hand, they better treat immigrants, orphans, and widows with compassion because that's fundamental to the human dignity of the person, right? By virtue of being made in God's image. Okay, here's a story that I think is really fascinating. This is Jesus and the Canaanite woman. Do you know this story? This particular painting by Juan de Flandes, the Christ and the Canaanite woman, from about 1500. Are you familiar with this account of Jesus and the Canaanite woman? Would someone be willing to read some of this passage out loud? It's about 7 or 8 verses long. Maybe we can read this passage and we'll take a break after that. Does that sound okay?
I can read. Do you want me to read in English or in Spanish?
I can pull up the Spanish. If you prefer, it'll take me a minute to let me see if I can find.
I can read in English if you'd like.
Would you all prefer for me to pull up a Spanish translation? I can do that.
Yes, please.
Yes, okay, I'll do that. Let me see if I can find one here. Okay. Let's see here. Sorry. I apologize. I should have had this pulled up before we began. Sorry about that.
I do have my Bible. If you want, I can read from my Bible.
Maybe that's better. I'm having trouble getting this pulled up with the slow internet. Is that okay?
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay,
Thank you,
thank you.
Gabby.
Okay. Sorry, are you reading
Yo no
something?
puedo oír. Gabby,
Oh, I,
sí.
now you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
I
Repite.
have to start again.
Sorry.
Español.
Jesús se retiró hacia el país de Tiro y de Sidón. Entonces, una mujer cananea que salió de aquella región comenzó a gritar: Señor, hijo de David, ten piedad de mí. Mi hija está terriblemente atormentada por un demonio. Pero él no le respondió nada. Sus discípulos se acercaron y le pidieron: Señor, atiéndela, porque nos persigue con sus gritos. Jesús respondió: Yo he sido enviado solamente a las ovejas perdidas del pueblo de Israel. Pero la mujer fue a postrarse ante él y le dijo: Señor, socórreme. Jesús le dijo: No está bien tomar el pan de los hijos para tirárselo a los cachorros. Ella respondió: Y sin embargo, Señor, los cachorros comen las migas que caen de la mesa de sus dueños. Entonces Jesús le dijo: Mujer, qué grande es tu fe, que se cumpla tu deseo. Y en ese momento su hija quedó curada.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for reading.
You're welcome.
I'd like to get some more. I'd like to get some interpretive feedback from you all. How do you understand this passage of the story? Is Jesus being mean to the Canaanite woman? What do you think of the interaction between Jesus and this woman here? And maybe I'll put you into breakout groups for another couple of minutes. We'll have a little conversation about this, and we'll take a break, and we'll come back and talk about, I think, about Hagar. Okay, let's see here.
Yeah, I don't think there are many opportunities for immigrants to understand their situation within the biblical context. You know, most of what we hear is Catholic social justice, a couple letters from bishops, which are some of them, or should be rooted in scriptures, right? But not holistically going to the roots and going to more depth. So, yeah.
I think it's complicated because not everything in the Bible is sensitive necessarily about the other. Some of the passages we looked at this morning already, even in this story, Jesus is not doesn't seem to be very sensitive to the Canaanite woman in the beginning here. And what does that mean? Is that a surprise? Is that what we expect of Jesus to to say those things about her?
Yeah.
It calls her a dog, and it's not right to throw scraps to the dog under the table, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and this is what I mean to exploring, that
Right. Yeah, that's
you
right.
just don't hear it or read it, and it's like,
Yeah.
it doesn't make sense. So either the Bible is wrong or let's not use it.
Right.
That's what I was wondering. It's so hard to understand the concept of this, but maybe you can help us.
Yeah. I'll try. I'll try.
Uh,
Does it seem like a hard passage? At does it seem like a strange thing?
it is, I mean, the reaction of Jesus, what you talk,
Right.
that's, like, because to me, Jesus, like, is all love and, and he's not reacting that way, like
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
holding her dog, like
Yes.
dog. So that's kind of hard words. So, yes. What do you think, Cindy?
Well, I I have trouble understanding the Bible just in in the easy stuff. Get to this complicated stuff. It's hard, and I think that's why I have so many questions. How to interpret, because even when you say things in English, I understand it a little better than when we read it in Spanish. Is complicated.
Well, now we are adding the other element that, Dr. Noble might be so in tune, which is translations and interpretations based on different translations of
That's right.
what the original.
That's right. Yeah, there are lots of layers of interpretation and communication involved. It's complicated. That's right. And I think that there's coding in the story. You know what I mean? Coding. I think that there are certain terms that are used intentionally in the story that are important to pay attention to. He calls her. It's a story about the Canaanite woman for one thing, which is an interesting way to label this person because Canaanites are the enemies of Israel.
So is that a theme in New Testament, John, when we hear women from outside of the Jewish community, like the Samaritan woman, it's another
Mhm.
example that comes to mind.
Mm-hmm.
The Canaanite woman.
Mhm.
I don't know if the daughter of Jairus. Oh, Jairus was a Jew,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah, you think about the Roman centurion. That's
Yeah.
another one we could look at. Hmm.
So is there a theme running in the Gospels that when it comes to
I
women?
think so. I think so. Not just women, but the foreigner.
Right.
Yeah, the El Otro. I think you get that. They interact with Jesus. That's right. That's right. And they have faith, and Jesus recognizes their faith, and they get some kind of there's some benefit to them from their faith, from their pursuit of Jesus. That's right.
So another question, John, and maybe for the group, have you heard the term inculturation? So IN.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
So my little research says that it's a it's an invention of it's a religious term.
mm-hmm,
But it's not so much in other groups or sciences. But anyhow, that USCCB gives the definition. It's long, but it comes down to the conversion of a culture according to the gospel values. And so they use several examples in New Testament and Old Testament to say, no culture is perfect, and every culture needs to experience a certain conversion.
mm-hmm,
That's only through the eyes of Jesus.
mm-hmm,
And so when we speak about enculturation, we're really talking about comparing what current society, you know, is promoting, against the gospel values.
mm-hmm.
And I wonder if that has a topic here, when we say, really Jesus challenged a lot of things that what was right.
Mm-hmm.
So there are different ways of interpreting even the most sacred values that a community has.
Yeah, thank you, Oscar. Thank you. I hope you'll bring that up again in a minute when we come together. Yeah. All right, I'm gonna end the breakout session, then I'm gonna turn the flow over to you, Oscar, for a little bit. That's okay.
Oscar, ¿nos pudiéramos quedar un poquito después los de Santa Rita para ver qué dice el padre? Porque le mandé las fechas, pero no me ha contestado. A lo mejor aquí como está ahorita puede ver su calendario.
Yeah, I think so. If you guys are willing to stay, we can just conclude the class and then just have a short meeting. Yeah.
Thank you. That way. I already talked to him, but I sent him a text, but just to make sure.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. How did the conversation go? What did you think about this story? Are you familiar with it? Have you read it before? What do you think of the Jesus who is portrayed in this story? What do you think of the Canaanite woman who is portrayed in the story?
Yo quisiera decir algo, pero pues no sé hablar inglés, entonces, ¿cómo le hago?
Just go ahead. We'll translate for you, Alejandra.
Ok, thank you. Yo le decía a esta, me tocó compartir con Yesenia y yo le comentaba que yo nunca había entendido, siempre había escuchado esa lectura y nunca había entendido por qué Dios le decía algo de los perros, que cómo iban a tirar algo a los perros. Entonces, esta Yesenia, espérenme, denme un segundo.
So far, Alejandra is saying that she had always trouble with this passage, especially with the notion of dogs and how Jesus reacted.
Entonces ya esta Yesenia me comentaba que era porque como algo así como que él iba con otras personas y ella se lo encontró en el camino. Entonces como que era nomás como una prueba de Dios para ver qué tan grande era su fe. Entonces eso me llamó mucho la atención de que dije, oh, ok, nunca había entendido el por qué él le decía esas palabras a la mujer, ¿verdad? Y le digo que también me llama mucho la atención que ella le dice, Jesús, hijo de David, ten piedad de mí. Le digo que para mí es una súplica como muy poderosa porque como que ahí ella se hace, como que lo hace ver que él es el rey y que él es el único que la puede ayudar. Y eso es todo.
So in conversation with Yesenia, we noticed that Jesus was going with other people, and we might interpret this as a test for the woman. But we also hear and like the cry out of how she recognizes Jesus as the Son of God, I believe is a term, or I forgot.
Son of
But
David, have
Son
pity,
of David.
have pity on me, Lord, Son of David, she says.
Yeah, so the cry out recognizes who Jesus is, and so it's a beautiful thing to hear that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Alejandro. What else did you notice, or what else did you think about this story? Anyone else?
I also remember that Jesus praised
the other's faith in 3 occasions, maybe, like the centurion and this woman.
That's right. That's a trope. That's a motif, an idea that comes up in multiple places in the Gospels, isn't it? Jesus interacts, and Oscar noticed the same thing, I think, that we find El Otro interacting with Jesus multiple times. The Samaritan woman, the Roman centurion, for example, they come to him and he engages with them in a way that might be countercultural or something like that. Yeah. Do you have your hand up, Gabby?
I believe God's salvation plan is unlimited. Uh, You have to be, you have to have your faith big to believe, and he can help you all the time. And probably Linda can help me more. She speaks better English.
Yes.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. Go ahead, Belinda.
No. Adelante, Jose.
I was with Father Mike, and what I've seen in this gospel is, uh, in my opinion, the others, when they tell Jesus, hey, do something for her, she's been following us. I think they were people closer, obviously, than Jesus, and they were tired of her, of listening to her crying. So they were tired, but Jesus already knew what he was going to do. Jesus is God, of course, and he was also teaching us something because she was the other. And sometimes when we close to God, sometimes we may interpret that, thinking, okay, we know this is the way. No, well, it is not our way. It is Jesus' way. So he's teaching us there something that about the others. I don't know if I got confused or I'm confusing you. That makes sense. Yeah. Sorry, it's a little crowded here, but I'm trying.
José está trabajando en una tienda. Es Oktoberfest en su pueblo.
I am the other right now.
Our group was, can I say something? Our group was again Yesenia, Maribel and Gabi. And they were nice enough to explain a little bit more of the scripture to me. And yes, like Gabi said, was that this woman's faith was so big that, you know, she asked Jesus just for a little bit of, you know, to help her with her daughter. But her faith was so big that she knew that Jesus could, help her. So that's what we shared in the group.
Thank you, everyone. I'd like to make a comment, and then I'd like to turn the floor over to Oscar actually, because he had some profound wisdom to share. So, Oscar, can I make a comment first, and then share to you? Okay. Let me see if I can go back to the scripture one more time.
And the other thing, John, is there any way that you can address this concern? Because everyone has been very nice, but I think we can all agree that Jesus sounds mean. And so
That's what I wanted to talk about now.
yeah, okay, thank you.
Okay. Can we rescue Jesus or make an apology for him somehow? So I'll look at the story one more time. I'll just read this in English because that's what I can do. The Canaanite woman of the district came and called, "Have pity on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon." He did not say a word. He did not say a word to her in answer to her. He ignored her first of all. Okay. His disciples came and asked him, "Send her away. She keeps calling out after us." He said in reply, finally he answers her and it says, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, not to El Otro." If you want to use that language. I don't think that's really true. Anyway, the woman came and did him homage, saying, "Lord, help me." And he said in reply, "It's not right to take the food of the children and throw it to the dogs." It's not nice to call people dogs today, and it wasn't nice to call people dogs in Jesus's time either. She said, "Please, Lord, even the dogs eat the scraps that fall from the table of their masters." And Jesus said in reply, "O woman, great is your faith. Let it be done as you wish." And her daughter was healed from that hour. Okay. So um, I don't I don't know that I have a great answer. I think the story is really interesting and important for talking about the other and Jesus and the Gospels. I'll just offer this one comment that there is a scholar, a New Testament, rather a prominent New Testament scholar here in Indianapolis. James McGrath teaches at Butler University, and James McGrath wrote a book called the title is something like "What Jesus Learned from Women," or what women taught Jesus, something like that. And I think McGrath is trying to recognize and honor um, the 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 teaching that Jesus is both fully human and fully divine. That not only is Jesus divine, but he's also human, and Jesus has things to learn. That's what McGrath is pointing out, and this and McGrath uses this episode in particular as an example of how Jesus learns something from the persistence of the woman who is described here in the story as a Canaanite. I mentioned in my little breakout group that I think there's some code language in this story. Um, we noticed that Jesus refers to the Canaanite woman as a dog. It's not right to take the food of the children and throw it to the dogs. So there's already a recognition that there's a difference, a distinction between the house of Israel and those who are not in the house of Israel. And even in the beginning of the story, the woman is described as a Canaanite. She's specifically a Canaanite woman. And a Canaanite woman that's a particular term that really goes back to the Old Testament. I don't know that the phrasing or the terminology of Canaanite it would be very prominent, maybe sort of obsolete in the time of the New Testament. But in the Old Testament, the Canaanites were the enemies of Israel, and they were a real threat, and they're the ones causing Israel grief, and the ones with whom Israel is not supposed to intermarry. So I think that term Canaanite is code um, for the other in a strong way. And here, someone else already noticed that, was it Jose? I think noticed that she calls him son of David or Lord and son of David. So she is acknowledging, recognizing who he is. Anyway, I think the whole story is serving to break down the distinction between Israel and um, the Canaanites or the other. I think that's partly what this story is doing. It's showing at the end, Jesus recognizes, acknowledges that this woman has great faith, and and then the power of God is brought to bear on the suffering of the daughter of this Canaanite woman. So even if the story doesn't start out in a happy way, it looks like there's unification, even a sort of universalization that happens toward the end of the story that wasn't there at the beginning. Um, that's one way to read this, at least. Oscar has something important to say.
Thank you, John. I was sharing with my group, and I can say this in Spanish because I'll probably do it better. But my previous job was with the Archdiocese in overseeing the intercultural ministries, and I've done in several capacities. And I remember when USCCB, that's the Conference of Bishops in the US, starting to write letters, produce materials, and the word enculturation, became very famous. And I found out that the word was not used in other scenarios or in other arenas, for lack of a better term. And so the definition that USCCB give of enculturation is basically the conversion of every culture, meaning that no culture is better than the other, but every culture needs to experience a conversion according to the gospel values. And by doing so, it's also recognizing that there are elements in every ethnic community that are closer to those gospel values. And the example that I always give when we speak about the differences of the Anglo community and the Hispanic Latino communities is, for example, the emphasis on family. Um, that Hispanic communities tend to be more collectivist, and so that is a gospel value. But at the same time, the collectivist cultures bring some challenges when we put a lot of emphasis on the structure of family. And I use the example of machismo, um, the violence that families experience in the name of its family. And so, how can we use this term um, when we hear some of these stories, using intercultural as the word that defines, yeah, every culture, every ethnic group needs to experience some type of conversion, but it has to be according to the gospel values. I'm hearing even through this passage, that even Jesus is recognizing that his own culture needed to experience um, some type of conversion, according to God's plan. And I guess that's what I mean by gospel values. It's not only Jesus and his message, but, the whole mystery of salvation and redemption uh, in the name of Jesus.
Thank you, Oscar. Any other comments before we take a break? Okay, how much time would you like? 5 minutes? Is that enough, or would you like a little longer? 10?
Mm-hmm.
10 minutes? Okay, how about 10 minutes? We'll come back at 10:55 or 9:55 by Belinda's clock. Okay, thank you. Take very many breaks. We went for a good long stretch. I'd like to do one more Bible passage with you all, and one more story that I think is relevant for this conversation that we're having this morning, and that's the story of Hagar and Ishmael. Let me see here. Share screen. Okay. We've talked about the categories of the vulnerable in the Bible. We talked about, let's see, widows, orphans, and immigrants as main categories of vulnerability in the Bible. Um, there's one story in my mind that sort of captures all three of these categories in the same story, and that is the story of Hagar and Ishmael, particularly in Genesis 16. They also show up in Genesis chapter 21. And I just think that this story is so important and so fascinating for conversations about the other. I've got a lot to say about this story because, um, and I'm going to apologize to you in advance. I wrote my dissertation about Hagar and Ishmael, so I'm full of thoughts about Hagar and Ishmael, and I think that they are really important. Maybe they're more important in my mind than they really are, but that's just because I spent so much time studying them. Um, so with apologies in advance, I'd like to talk about Hagar and Ishmael with you for a little while. Um, in starting though, I want to just remind us about these categories of the vulnerable, namely widows, orphans, and immigrants. All of them are not attached to land, which is what makes them really vulnerable. Um, as a footnote, this is just a footnote, and I don't know how important it is. Maybe not that important, but as a footnote, back in the 80s, there was a sociologist whose name was Kimberly Crenshaw, and she's the one who first coined the phrase intersectional, which is a concept. It's a phrase that is acknowledging that um, it's possible to occupy multiple categories of of minority statuses at the same time, and that for people who occupy multiple spheres of vulnerability or multiple minority statuses simultaneously, the effect can be more than the sum of the parts. It can be there's a multiplication of othering that happens for a person who is not only a woman, but is also an immigrant woman, or who is not only um, a woman, perhaps maybe has a disability of some sort, or some other social designation that puts them in the category of other in multiple ways. So anyway, that's a concept called intersectionality. And Kimberly Crenshaw, back in the 80s, in 1989, she shined a light on that reality. Um, the, the the three categories, widows, orphans, and immigrants, show up in a number of places. They're used together 9 different times in Deuteronomy, in Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, Zechariah, Malachi. So the biblical authors in multiple different places, multiple different authors are aware that these three groups of people are vulnerable. So I think that when we think about the vulnerable in the Bible, it's worth contemplating also how what the categories of the vulnerable might be in today's world, because in antiquity the thing that these three groups had in common is that they weren't attached to land, right? If you were a widow, if you were an orphan, if you were an immigrant, that meant that you didn't have a connection to land. So there's a lot of overlap maybe in the modern world between vulnerability and being an orphan or a widow or an immigrant. But there may be other types of people who are otro today as well, or who may be vulnerable too. But one of the things that fascinates me about the story of Hagar is that she and her son, I think, represent in a way all three of these categories at the same time. So I'm going to pull open the scripture passage here. Oops. Now, Genesis 16 is the first introduction to Hagar and Ishmael. And Genesis 16 occurs, you may be surprised, it occurs in between Genesis 15 and Genesis 17. All right. And Genesis 15 is the first giving of the covenant to Abram. All right. In Genesis 15, God makes a covenant with Abram. And then in Genesis 17, God makes a covenant with Abram, or Abraham now, again. And why does God make a covenant with Abraham 2 times? It's not really clear. The two stories don't necessarily show an awareness or any kind of interaction with each other, but 2 different times God makes a covenant with Abram or Abraham. Modern scholars think that these 2 different stories are there because they come from 2 different sources. So the Genesis 15 version of the Abraham covenant, modern scholars attribute to the Yahwist source, or J, and the Genesis 17 version of the Abrahamic covenant, modern scholars attribute to the priestly source, P. So, sandwiched in between the Abrahamic covenants of Genesis 15 and Genesis 17 is the story about Hagar and Ishmael. And it's at this point that I would like to invite someone else to read the story of Genesis 16, the story of Hagar and Ishmael here, if you would. And I'm still struggling to get a good translation. I do have another translation of the of um, scripture in Spanish. I know it's not really the best one. I have this Reina Valera one. I can use that if you like, or if you'd rather I don't, that's fine too. I have let me see. I have this one, Sagradas Escrituras. Is one of these preferable to the group over the other?
I
Doesn't
go
matter.
with Sagradas Escrituras. Yeah.
Sagradas Escrituras? Okay. In that case, Belinda, do you think you would be willing to read the story?
Yes, I will.
I would appreciate it.
Okay. 1 through, okay. Y Sarai, mujer de Abraham, no le daba hijos, y ella tenía una sierva egipcia que se llamaba Agar. Dijo pues Sarai a Abraham: He aquí ahora el Señor me ha vedado de dar a luz. Te ruego que entres a mi sierva, por ventura tendré hijos de ella. Y oyó Abraham al dicho de Sarai. Y Sarai, la mujer de Abraham, tomó a Agar, su sierva egipcia, al cabo de 10 años que había habitado Abraham en la tierra de Canaán, y la dio a Abraham, su marido, por mujer. Y él entró a Agar, la cual concibió, y cuando vio que había concebido, miraba con desprecio a su señora. Entonces Sarai dijo a Abraham: Mi afrenta es sobre ti. Yo puse mi sierva en tu seno, y viéndose embarazada me mira con desprecio. Juzgué el Señor entre mí y ti. Y respondió Abraham a Sarai: He aquí tu sierva en tu mano, haz con ella lo que bien te pareciere. Entonces Sarai la afligió y ella huyó de su presencia. Keep going.
Please.
Y la halló el ángel del Señor junto a una fuente de agua en el desierto, junto a la fuente que está en el camino del sur. Y le dijo: Agar, sierva de Sarai, ¿de dónde vienes tú y a dónde vas? Y ella respondió: Huyo de delante de Sarai, mi señora. Y le dijo el ángel del Señor: Vuélvete a tu señora y humíllate bajo su mano. Le dijo también el ángel del Señor: Multiplicaré tanto tu simiente que no será contada por la multitud. Y le dijo aún el ángel del Señor: He aquí que has concebido y darás a luz un hijo y llamarás su nombre Ismael, porque ha oído el Señor tu aflicción. Y él será hombre fiero, su mano contra todos y las manos de todos contra él, y delante de todos sus hermanos habitará. Entonces ella llamó el nombre del Señor, que hablaba con ella, Ata el Roy: Tú eres el Dios de la vista, porque, porque dijo: No he visto también aquí las espaldas del que me vio. Por lo cual llamó al pozo, pozo del viviente que me ve. He aquí está entre Cades y Beret. Y Agar dio a luz a un hijo a Abraham, y llamó a Abraham el nombre de su hijo que le dio Agar, Ismael. Y era Abraham de edad de 86 años cuando Agar dio a luz a Ismael.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Belinda.
Sure.
Appreciate that very much. Thank you. Okay. So here we have a story about the household of Abram and Sarai, and they have a problem because Sarah can't get pregnant, and God has made a promise in the previous chapter that Abram is going to be the ancestor of, or he's going to have a multitude of offspring. And so the problem is that they can't get pregnant. And so Hagar is a Egyptian servant or slave in the house of Abram and Sarai. And so Sarah has the idea that maybe Abram can have offspring on her behalf through Hagar, sort of as a surrogate. Um, the first question I would like to pose to you is, what do you think of this strategy? Do you think this is a bad idea? What do you think of it from the perspective of the biblical author of the story? Do you think that the idea for Hagar to be a surrogate is what do you think the narrator's point of view is on this strategy, I guess, is my question.
Tengo una duda. La pregunta es, ¿qué pensamos sobre la historia? ¿Sí?
Yes. ¿Y qué crees que el autor está diciendo? So what do you think the author is trying to say?
Oh, ok. Porque yo tengo más bien una pregunta, una duda. A mí este pasaje me pone como en observación, se podrá decir, porque digo, ¿por qué mandaría tener hijos con otra mujer? O sea, ¿por qué no le concebiría mejor tener hijos con su propia mujer y por qué le mandó tener hijos con otra mujer? Como que ahí como que yo digo, ¿por qué está pasando esto?
So it's not a response to the question, but it's actual a question. You know, why would God allow in this passage that a son shall be conceived with another woman and not the wife, in this case Sarah?
Yeah, this is the question. This is exactly the question I'm trying to probe with you all. Um, whenever I share this story with my students, they they often say, "Well, this shows a lack of faith from Abraham or Abram or Sarah or something, because Sarah couldn't get pregnant, and they should have just trusted God that she would eventually, or something." Um, I'm not sure that that's the perspective of the narrator. I'm not sure if the original author or the original audience would have looked at it that way. This is a patriarchal world, and at that time, men sometimes did have multiple wives. Even even the patriarchs, certainly Jacob was married to two sisters, Rachel and Leah. Um, and he had offspring through their handmaids, their servants, their slaves too. Um, and in the narrative, there's no negative judgment that's made on for that reason. And I guess I would also point out that God makes a promise in Genesis 15 to Abram, but he doesn't mention anything about Sarah being the mother in Genesis 15. He only says that Abram's going to be the father of, with many offspring. It's not until Genesis 17 that God specifies that the son of the promise, the son of the covenant, will be through Sarah. So that's just a detail I wanted to point out, that um, I don't I don't know if we should read this from our sort of current modern lens, in which this would have been frowned upon as a strategy necessarily. In retrospect, it didn't work out very well, it seems. Um, Hagar is mistreated by Sarai in this story. Um, it doesn't really say clearly why Sarai is upset with Hagar. It says something like in Hebrew, it says something like, in the eyes of Hagar, her mistress became light, or became somehow perhaps like of lower standing or something like that. I think Sarah is offended that Hagar maybe doesn't treat her with enough respect, or look at her in the same way anymore now that she has conceived, whereas Sarah couldn't. I think that's the perception of Sarai, that she doesn't, whether or not Hagar does this, that's what Sarah experiences and maybe projects onto Hagar, that she doesn't offer her enough respect, I think. Anyway, for whatever reason, Sarah gets very upset when Hagar conceives, and it says that she mistreats Hagar. She oppresses and abuses her, and it's so bad for Hagar that Hagar runs away into the wilderness. And when you remember that for Hagar not to be affiliated with Abram any longer, not to have access to his resources, it's really sort of like a suicide mission, because she has nothing in the wilderness. There's nothing for her. There's no way for her to survive. She's a pregnant woman and she goes into the wilderness. That's how bad it is for Hagar living with Sarai. Sarai is mistreating her so badly that Hagar would rather have a slow death in the wilderness of starvation and dehydration than to be with Sarai anymore. And so it's when we get into the wilderness for Hagar that the angel of the Lord appears to her, and he asks her some casual questions. Where are you coming from? What are you doing? Where are you going? And she says, I'm running away from my mistress, from Sarai. And God tells her, what does it say in Spanish? Can you, what is what does the angel of the Lord say to Hagar when she tells him that she has been oppressed or mistreated? She's running away. What's the sense of it in Spanish?
What verse is that, John?
Well, let me look in English.
9.
Verse 9, thank you.
Versículo 9. El ángel contestó, vuélvete a tu señora y humíllate bajo su mano.
Yeah.
Es poderoso y difícil por Agar.
So what is the angel telling, what kind of instruction is the angel giving to Hagar? What does he tell her to do there? What's the sense of it in Spanish?
Well, one way of interpreting it is humiliate yourself to her.
So the angel demands that she return and that she offer that respect that Sarah is demanding.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know exactly what the sense of it in Spanish. Um, I know that in Hebrew the phrasing is something like "go back and submit to her oppression,"
Yeah.
is something like what it says in Hebrew. Go back and submit to her oppression is what the angel is telling Hagar. And really, that's the only way that Hagar can survive, is by going back to the household of Abram and Sarah, because there's nothing for her in the wilderness. There's no way for her to live, and she's pregnant and starving and thirsty. She has no other option. The angel tells her to go back and in the Hebrew phrase is go back and submit to her oppression, something like that. Um, and then God tells her, the angel tells her that she's going to have a son and that she's going to name him Ishmael. All right. His name is going to be Ishmael. And the name Ishmael has a significance. What's the reason why she will name him Ishmael?
Did it mean that God had heard her
That's
suffering?
that's right. That's what the name Ishmael. The name Ishmael is a sentence in Hebrew. Okay. Um, the name Ishmael is a sentence in Hebrew that means God hears. God hears. That's what Ishmael means. Um, El at the end of Ishmael, you may recognize El, that's a name for God. And Yishma means he hears. So Yishma El means God hears. So God is telling Hagar that he is aware, he understands, he perceives the situation, and she's going to name her son Ishmael as a marker of God's understanding, his awareness of her suffering. And then he gives a little prophecy about Ishmael and what will happen with Ishmael. Somehow I've I've got the wrong cursor. I'm not sure what to do here. I can't get to scroll. Okay. Anyway, I'm trying to get this to scroll down somehow. Let me see.
I think you're using one of the tools up there where there's a pencil.
Yeah. Yeah. How do I click off of that?
I think you just click on the pencil and
Where is the pencil?
uh, up. Well,
Oh, yeah.
even higher, where
Higher. Up here?
the icons even higher.
Higher.
Up
Yeah, now to your other way.
there.
Yeah,
This?
there. Yeah.
I think that's a different app, I think.
Okay.
Oh,
Yeah, that's okay.
oh, I see what you mean.
Okay. All right. Let me see here.
Or maybe right click. Is there any other option on right click?
Okay, I'm just gonna try to exit this application. Okay, gosh, I'm having some computer difficulties here.
Or you can just stop sharing the screen and see if that allows.
Okay, there we go. Okay. Sorry about that, everyone. Let me see what happens. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna share again. Let's see. Goodness gracious. Okay, at least okay, I'm gonna work in English if that's okay for a minute. So anyway, God tells her to go back, submit to her authority or her oppression, something. And then he tells her that her descendants are going to be numerous. This is a covenantal promise that Abram also enjoys. And then he gives a prophecy about Ishmael. You're pregnant, you'll bear a son, you'll name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heeded your affliction. That's what Ishmael means. That's what the name means. Um, God hears. And then he says that Ishmael will be a wild ass of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And alongside all his kindred, he shall he encamp, meaning in a sort of military way. All right. So what what does that prophecy mean? Um, gracious. Why does God say that to Hagar? What do you think? What do you think this means about Ishmael? That is, he's going to be a wild ass of a man. His hand will be against everyone. Everyone's hand will be against him. And alongside his kindred or against his kindred, he shall encamp, I think, in a military way. What is the angel saying to Hagar about her son? Is this a nice thing or is it not a nice thing?
John, I do have a question before answering that. I don't know if you mind. In trying to understand the audience, how did the people actually understand that God was communicating to an Egyptian and that in a way, um, yeah, there was some divine intervention to a slave, to a woman. So, does that have some consideration in terms of how we should respond to that question? You know, would the audience would be shocked or Or
I
again,
think
go
I
ahead.
think that's the right question to ask, Oscar. And in some way, to use an idiom, you're stealing my thunder a little bit here. So that's a question that I'd like to come back to in a minute. But that's the right question, Oscar. That's exactly right. That's the important question here, I think. But I guess I'd like to ask you about this prophecy, though. What do you think about God saying to Hagar that her son is going to be a wild ass of a man in his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him? Is that nice or not nice?
Not nice.
Not nice.
Mhm.
I disagree. I think it's nice. I think that's gospel to Hagar. That's what I think. So let me see here. If I go back, the Lord has heeded your affliction. He shall be a wild ass of a man, his hand against. So the problem that Hagar has is that she is
Right.
enslaved.
Yeah.
Hagar is
Okay.
enslaved and she is controlled. Hagar doesn't even control her sexuality. She is a pawn in the household of Abram and Sarai. She is an object for them to use according to their desires or wishes or plans. Um, Hagar hasn't had a lot of control, and then she gets punished when she successfully conceives with Abram. So I think this is a I think this is good news for Hagar because Ishmael, her son, is not going to be controlled by anyone. That's how I interpret this. His hand against everyone, everyone's hand against him. No one will control Ishmael. He's going to be a wild ass of a man. He is going to be someone who has some agency in his life and his outcome and his fate. That's how I read it. That might not be right, but one of the reasons why I feel that way, why I think that, is because Hagar responds to this prophecy in verse 13, and it says, to Yahweh who spoke to her, to the Lord who spoke to her, she gave a name, saying, um, have I, saying, you are God who sees me. In Hebrew, she says, you are El Roi, Elroi, El Roi. You are God who sees me. And then it said, and this Hebrew is difficult to translate. She says, have I really seen God and remained alive after he saw me? So it's important to notice, this is a big deal, that Hagar gives a name to God. Hagar is the only person in the Bible who gives a name to God. God gives names to other people. No one else gives a name to God. That's a pretty big deal. And to go back to what Oscar was saying a minute ago, Hagar is a no one. She's a nobody. She is the ultimate. I think she's the intersection of El Otro, or the vulnerable. She is separated from Abram because she's a runaway. She's in the wilderness, really not connected to Abram anymore. She's pregnant with a son who, at this point, effectively would have the status of an orphan because he wouldn't be attached to Abram anymore. And she's also an immigrant. She's not from the dominant group there. She doesn't belong to the household of Abram. She's an Egyptian slave there living in Canaan with the household of Abram and Sarai. So she occupies all three of those categories. And God meets her. And what I think is so interesting about Genesis 16 being situated in between Genesis 15 and 17 is that this is the moment when God's relationship with his people, the scope of his relationship, is narrowed into this one family. And this is a story about chosenness and the ultimate story of insiders. If you're a son of Abraham, then you belong to the people of God. Then you are Israel. if you're not the son of Abraham, then you are not one of the chosen people. You are not in the community of God, the Israelites. This is where that whole story begins of chosenness and the question of insiders and outsiders. And it's right here at this moment, as Oscar pointed out so um, astutely, that here you have the angel of the Lord appearing to Hagar, who is the ultimate expression of El Otro, occupying multiple categories of vulnerability: widow, orphan, alien, or immigrant, I think, in this case. Here, precisely in the moment, sandwiched in between Genesis 15 and Genesis 17, where you have a narrow, specific, particular covenant with Abram or Abraham. In the middle of that story, in Genesis 16, you have this narrative about Hagar. And Hagar, at the end of the story, she gives a name to God, El Roi, which is, you are a God who sees me. And I think that name, El Roi, God who sees me, is a nice complement to the name that God tells Hagar to have for her son Ishmael. So Ishmael means God hears, and the name that Hagar gives to God is El Roi, a God who sees me. So you have in Genesis 16 these verbs of sensory perception. God hears and God sees the oppression of his people in Genesis 16. Ultimately, God cares about the El Otro. God cares about the the widow, the orphan, the immigrant. Even in the middle of the story about the chosenness of Abram, there's an entire chapter devoted in Genesis 16 to the person who is not included among the covenantal people of God, the Israelites. And it's a story about God's compassion. It's a story about God being aware of Hagar's suffering through these verbs of sensory perception, seeing and hearing. Does that make sense? Isn't that a beautiful story? Isn't that nice?
It is so powerful. Yeah.
It's one of my favorite stories in the whole Bible. It might be my favorite story in the whole Bible. I think it's really important in the salvation history. God cares about everyone. I think is signaled in the story about Hagar and Ishmael, even when the covenant is narrowed down to Abraham. Here's a question for you. Um, Later in Israel's history, I know you all have some scriptural Bible awareness. I know you do. How is it that Israel finds themselves slaves in Egypt? Later in Israel's history, they go into Egypt, into slavery in Egypt. How does that happen? How do they find themselves in Egypt in the first place? Do you know the story?
I think they multiplied a lot, so Pharaoh was um, afraid that they would rebel and take over Egypt.
Yeah, good. That's right. That's right, Yesenia. But how did they land in Egypt in the first place? Is my question.
Was it when Abraham had to move from his birthplace?
Yeah. So Abram moves from his birthplace into the land of Canaan, and then Abram has this son Ishmael, which we just read the story, and then in Genesis 18, God announces to Sarah that she's gonna be pregnant and has Isaac. So anyway, now Isaac will have two sons, Jacob and Esau, and then Jacob has 12 sons, Do you know which one is the favorite son of Jacob?
Was it Joseph?
Joseph, that's right. And how do Joseph's brothers feel about Joseph having favorite status?
Jealous?
That's right. And what do they do to express their jealousy? How do they respond?
They sell him as a slave?
That's right. They sell him as a slave. That's right. Who buys Joseph from his jealous brothers?
I don't remember what foreigners.
This is a hard question. I'm really probing how familiar you are with the story. This is a small detail.
Was it the Ishmaelites?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So here, let me show you. In Genesis 39, it says, when Joseph was taken down to Egypt, an Egyptian, Potiphar, an official of Pharaoh and his chief steward, bought him from the Ishmaelites who brought Joseph there to Egypt. In Genesis 37, it says that Joseph's brothers sold him to Midianites. Here in this passage in 39, it says it was the Ishmaelites who brought Joseph into Egypt. Um, are you all familiar with the term? This is really we're mixing religions here a little bit. Are you familiar with the term karma? Do you know that? You know what that means? Karma. You might call it retribution. The fancy Latin phrase is quid pro quo, this for that. Um, there's a little bit of poetic justice in that Israel will be sold into slavery in Egypt after Israel's ancestors oppressed an Egyptian slave.
Wow.
Does that make sense? Do you see that?
God, God's sense of humor.
There is, I think that is present in the story. So the Israelites are going to become slaves in Egypt after Abram and Sarah oppress and enslave an Egyptian slave themselves. So we get, for example, in Exodus 2, let's see. Um, yeah, we get in the story of the Exodus. I'm just fast forwarding a little bit now. This is all related to the Hagar and Ishmael story, I think. When Moses gets to Egypt, I don't know. I'm assuming that you know the story of Moses a little bit. Moses is an Israelite baby boy born at the time when Pharaoh is demanding that all the Israelite boys will be killed because he wants to limit the population of the Israelites. And Moses' mother puts him in a basket and saves him by floating him down the Nile. And then Moses is saved by the daughter of Pharaoh. And then um, Moses gets in trouble because he intercedes or he intervenes when an Egyptian taskmaster is oppressing an Israelite slave, and Moses steps in and breaks it up. And Moses kills the taskmaster who is oppressing or who is abusing the Hebrew slave. And so now Moses himself must leave as a refugee. He must leave from Egypt, and he flees. And then we get to Moses here in the wilderness, and it says, let's see, he marries this woman Zipporah, and she conceives and bears a son, and Moses names the son Gershom. And the meaning of the word Gershom is, well, in Hebrew, Ger is an immigrant, and Shom means there. So the name of the boy is immigrant there. For he said, I am an immigrant. Here is translated stranger. I am an immigrant residing in a foreign land. And that's so important to the identity of Moses that he names his son Gershom, which means an immigrant in a foreign land, an immigrant there. Okay, then we get to the burning bush. And I am fascinated by the verbs of sensory perception. Do you see it in the story of the burning bush? God heard the moaning of his people. God saw the Israelites, and God knew. This is what motivates, what inspires God to respond to the oppression of his people in Egypt, because his sensory perception is turned on and he sees, he hears the groaning of his people. He saw the Israelites and he knew. Okay, so that's what, I don't think it's a coincidence. I don't think it's a mistake, that we have the very same verbs in the Egyptians in the story of the Exodus that we just read about back in Genesis 16. God names Hagar's son Ishmael, which means God hears. And what's the name that Hagar gives to God?
El Roi,
El Roi, which means
God sees.
God sees. So hearing and seeing shows up again here at the beginning in Exodus. God heard and God saw. Okay, and then that is what begins this episode of the burning bush, where God commissions Moses to go and be the leader to let his people go out of Egypt. I just want to make sure you're tracking with me so far. Do you understand the connections I'm trying to make here between Hagar and Ishmael and the people of Israel on the other hand? That there's a that there I'm trying to imply that there is some kind of a foreshadowing between the story of Hagar and Ishmael, who get oppressed and abused as an Egyptian slave in the household of Abraham, Sarah, on the one hand, and what will happen to Israel in Egypt, who will also get oppressed by Egyptian oppressors. So I used that word karma a minute ago, but that's really that's rooted in another religious tradition. What we're talking about is retribution. What we're talking about is a kind of justice, a kind of um,
The ironies of life.
a little bit of irony. But in my opinion, um, this is not this is not just a retributive punishment that Israel is enduring in their oppression in Egypt. I don't think God is just punishing them exactly, but in my opinion, there's something redemptive about Israel's experience in Egypt, that they earn, that they experience what it feels like to be oppressed, so that they in turn will have empathy, so that they in turn will have empathy when um, they encounter immigrants and the vulnerable again in the future. So if we go back to, let me see, if we go back to these scripture passages, share my screen one more time. If we go back to, let's say, Exodus 22:21, this is legislation. These are laws that God gives to Israel right after they come out of Egypt. This is so in the Exodus story, when Israel emerges from the land of Egypt and God has delivered them from their oppression under Pharaoh, then he gives them a bunch of laws. And prominent among these laws is this one in Exodus 22. You shall not wrong any widow or orphan. If you ever wrong them and they cry out to me, I will listen. My sensory perception will be attentive to their cry. Right? That's what God tells Hagar. He sees and he hears their oppression, right? My wrath will flare up and I will kill you with the sword, and then your own wives will be widows and your children will become orphans. So there's something experiential about Israel's oppression that is supposed to help them to understand the significance of showing hospitality, showing love, showing compassion to the vulnerable, to the widow, to the orphan, to the immigrant. Here in Exodus chapter 23:9, it says, again, you shall not oppress. Here it's translated resident alien. Really, it means immigrant. You shall not oppress an immigrant. You well know, here's this empathy coming in again. You know how it feels to be an immigrant. You were once immigrants yourselves in the land of Egypt. The name Hagar, let me see. Now, here, I'm going to write something down here. Can you, are you able to see my screen still? Can you see what I'm writing at the bottom? The name Hagar comes from, in Hebrew, 3 consonants, the He, Gimel, and Resh. That's how you spell Hagar in Hebrew. Let's see if I think I can write it in Hebrew, in fact. That's what Hagar's name looks like in Hebrew, like that, He, Gimel, Resh. And in Hebrew, the word ger, Gimel, Resh, means immigrant. And in Hebrew, the letter He, when it's attached to the front of another word, means the definite article the. So I can't prove that this is intentional, but I just think it is. But He, Gimel, Resh, the letters of Hagar's name really spell the immigrant. That's really what her name is, the immigrant. That's what the same letters are used in Hagar's name as the letters that you would use for the immigrant. Hagar's the immigrant. And that's what you see in this passage. You shall not oppress. Let's see. Yeah, you shall not oppress an immigrant. Let me see if I can pull it up in Hebrew. Yeah, anyway, here it is. Gerim means stranger, sojourner, something like that. You can see the ger there. That's what I'm trying to point out. I think it's an illusion. I think there's an echo of Hagar in this legislation. That's what I'm trying to point out. And it has to do with empathy. And we were talking about karma or retribution before, but I don't think it's just to punish Israel because of what they did to Hagar, but I think one of the things that they're supposed to get from the experience in Egypt is an understanding of the experience of the heart of the immigrant, of the heart of the person who is vulnerable in a foreign land, who has a vulnerable status. I think that's what they're supposed to get from their time in Egypt, which you see in the legislation there. Okay. Is any of that making sense? Do you have confusion? Did I go too quickly? What do you think about that stuff? I'm looking for some feedback. Does it make sense to you? Um, do you have any questions or comments?
So is it fair to say that we are before, I guess the best comment that I can come up with is God's ways are not our ways? I mean, would that be consistent with uh, the plan or the economy, that we find in God's plan for humanity? That every time that we attempt to say we got it, that God's ways are not our ways. Because I keep going back to how they heard this and how they continue to uplift some of these stories that even Jesus himself, as we saw, had to encounter this, there's more to it. I don't know, I'm just overwhelmed in a good way, with the emphasis on the immigrant.
Thank you, Oscar. Yeah, I can affirm from my own experience that God's ways don't always align with my ways. I can certainly affirm that. Appreciate that.
So there is a comment from Maribel. May I read it, Maribel? So Maribel is writing, thank you, John. It's a little bit difficult for me in trying to understand everything. I'm doing my best. Um, thanks for your patience.
Thank you for your patience, Marbel. I apologize to the degree that I've made it complicated or hard to understand, and for my limited Spanish.
And John, I'm fascinated with this class. I feel bad that I'm trying to be there as much and being here, but it's very interesting how everything is connected all the way. And I'm thinking now too, it brings my thoughts to this moment also. So I'm fascinated with it. It's complicated, yes, it is, but it's also
Yeah.
it's amazing.
Thank you, Jose. Thank you. I guess one of the things that lands for me the most is that God doesn't step in and make everything better for Hagar. He tells her to go back and submit to Sarah, even though that's not pleasant or nice. But there is a long game. There is a sense in which good things will unfold for her and for Ishmael in the long term, even if in the short term things are difficult. That's for me, that's hard. I'll admit that's for me that's hard because I would prefer that God makes things better immediately. But that doesn't seem to be what happens for Hagar, and it's not exactly what happens for Israel either.
Yeah, thank you for that comment, John. I'm just trying to situate myself in occasions where I have seen that oppression, especially with women. When I was in seminary, one of the things that we used to do over the summer was to go to farming camps where immigrants would just travel around the country. And it was just so difficult to hear the stories from women, how they were put to work, abused, not only with power, salaries, lack of benefits, sexually. There were lots of stories where they or immigrant women that were working on behalf of their children, and they had to submit almost like a slave because some of them lived on campus and trailers, and it was just so devastating. And this is helpful just to see how sometimes, again, within His divine plan, chooses not to intervene or rescue immediately, I'm not saying this is a consolation, but it is somehow putting us in a bigger perspective or different perspective than thinking that, everything goes unseen and that indeed God hears and listens to
Mhm.
everything that happens.
Yeah, and it seems like that really makes a difference to Hagar. But at the end of the story in Genesis 16, I think she's very pleased at what God tells her, and she gives a name to God and says, "You are El Roi, you are a God who sees me." And I think she benefits from knowing and from understanding that God sees her, that God has awareness, and God cares. Okay, well, for next week, the plan, my goal, what I would like to do is talk about Ruth in particular and Tamar, more women, actually all more women next Saturday. That's exclusively what we'll do is talk about women more, include especially Ruth and Tamar, and then maybe Esther and Judith. We'll see how much time we have to get into those guys, but especially the story of Ruth, I think is an important story because Ruth is a Moabite woman, and here let me share my screen with you one last time. Show you one thing. When Solomon loved all these foreign women, um, he got in trouble for it. He had 700 wives and 300 concubines, and they turned his heart, it says. But at the top of the list of the people that he married, the foreigners, are Moabites. So Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. But first in the list are the Moabites, and Ruth herself is a Moabite woman, right? So Ruth is an example of a foreign woman, and her story is very positive in scripture. So I want to spend some time in Ruth. I think this is another one of those stories that's kind of like the story of Hagar, that is very important in salvation history. Um, I don't know. I think it's difficult to overstate the significance, the importance of Ruth in the story of the Bible. I think Ruth is very important. So we'll spend some time talking about Ruth next time. All right. Any concluding thoughts or comments or objections from anyone? And we can be done. Thank you for your patience. I'm really grateful. Thank you. Thank you for the privilege.